In light of the demonstrations nationwide in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, we are now seeing them give way to looting as well as some destruction. So the president is now warning states that if they cannot get them under control, that he will send in the U.S. military. Joining me now is Professor Amanda Tyler of UC Berkeley Law School to let us know more about what is the Insurrection Act. Hello there, Professor.
Hi.
So why is this particular law now in question in regards to what the president has said?
Well, the Insurrection Act is one of many laws that Congress has passed that allow the president to make emergency-like declarations so as to invoke expanded powers beyond the normal powers we would expect the president to wield. And in particular here, it is a law that's been on the books for over 200 years, and that allows the president to use the military in order to help restore law and order. If he declares that there is domestic violence, an insurrection, or rebellion, or something on that order of magnitude.
Does the state's leader have to directly ask for that added support, or can the president just go ahead and make the call himself?
The president can go ahead and make the call himself. There are different provisions in the act, one of which does allow for a state to request kind of assistance, and that has happened in the past. It happened when we witnessed the riots following, with respect to Rodney King, but it also allows the president to make the call himself or herself, as the case may be, and we have many examples of that.
And why could that possibly be a concern?
The concern here is a very basic one with respect to our constitutional tradition. We fought a war for independence to get away from a regime in which the military was wielded by the king to keep subjects in their place. And so it is sort of hardwired into our constitutional fabric that we don't want to see the military in a law enforcement posture, in a domestic law enforcement posture. And in fact, we have a longstanding act called the Posse Comitatus Act, which says that as Congress specifically authorizes the military being used in this way, the president can never do so. But of course, the Insurrection Act does give him the authorization to do this, the kinds of circumstances that it mentions, like, as I said, insurrection or rebellion or domestic violence on the score or on the level such law and order cannot be maintained.
In response to the destruction that came with the nationwide protests, the president called it a disgrace and said that he's already dispatching thousands of heavily armed soldiers, military personnel, and law enforcement officers to stop the rioting, looting, vandalism, assaults, and in his words, the wanton destruction of property. He said that if a city or a state refuses to take action that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then he will deploy the United States military and, in his words, quickly solve the problem for them. So does that mean that he is now invoking this act?
No, and I think this is something to pay close attention to in the hours and days that follow. He needs to formally invoke the act, and he has not yet done that. And if you think back to early in the ongoing COVID pandemic, he threatened to wield the Defense Production Act, which is another emergency statute like this, and he kept threatening to invoke it and then didn't. So, those of us who've been watching these parallel stories unfold, we're wondering whether this is really just rhetoric or whether he'll back it up. And we'll find out in the coming days.
Today, troops could be seen heading to the White House, and it was reported the military, police, and the Secret Service forcefully dispersed peaceful protesters at a nearby park by the White House with tear gas and rubber bullets. So is that lawful, or is that at all related to the Insurrection Act?
This raises a couple of really interesting questions. The first is that the sort of situation that the Insurrection Act was meant to address? And I would argue no. Where you have peaceful protesters, like what we saw in Lafayette Square, that's not what the Insurrection Act is about. It's about where order law enforcement cannot control and keep order. And peaceful protests don't fit into that description. The question then becomes if the president does invoke this authority and use it in context to go after peaceful protests, will anyone push back? And you could imagine people challenging the invocation of the act in court. The problem is that there's a long track record of courts deferring to the executive in situations like this. So I think we would be hard pressed to see a court, unlikely to see a court push back if the president does invoke this authority, which is why, norms have evolved around this act that it should never be invoked lightly. It hasn't been invoked in almost 3 decades, and it's usually invoked very carefully and very specifically in a localized fashion. And Trump is talking in very broad terms about invoking it. And so that is something that makes, I think, all of us who are watching closely very nervous. One of the ways in which it has been invoked in the past was to protect the rights of African Americans to equal protection under the law. And in particular, Eisenhower and Kennedy both invoked the Insurrection Act to protect the desegregation process of school. And later we saw it invoked to protect the marchers in Selma. So again, it would be sort of tragically ironic to see it invoked here to go after particularly peaceful protesters who are doing the very same thing. They're asking for an end to racism in the country.
Thank you so much, Professor Amanda Tyler with UC Berkeley, for joining us and talking about the latest news.
Thank you.
You're watching Chronon, the Bay Area streaming news 24/7.